Hi, welcome back to the channel and video number 107. This video will start out with a few clarifications and facts relating to the last video. Then we'll move on to a discussion about high altitude intercooling, which I hope you'll find interesting. And I do want to thank all the new people that have subscribed to the channel. We had a lot from the last video. There seemed to be a lot of interest in it. And we'll discuss some more technical details on airplanes, engines, turbocharging, anything that's interesting to the viewers out there. Okay, to start things off, we're going to talk about a few points about the last video on the Raptor's turbo system. Still seem to be a few people not convinced that you can't use compressors of the same size on a staged or compound turbo system. Well, here we've got a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which has a two-stage, two-speed supercharger system. And you'll see here the first stage compressor wheel is quite a bit larger than the second stage one. And here we've got an illustration of a Rolls-Royce Griffin engine, also with a two-stage supercharger system. And again, first stage compressor, large, second stage compressor, small. So one final illustration about multi-stage centrifugal compressors in case it's not clear yet. This is a MAN industrial multi-stage compressor. It has three stages on this side. This is the first stage inlet, so air comes in here, is compressed, goes to an intercooler. It's fed into the second stage compressor here. It's compressed some more. That goes to another intercooler stage. And that air comes into the third stage here, compressed further, and the discharge is here at very high pressure. So you'll note again that the first stage is the largest, second stage is smaller, the third stage is the smallest. Next, I want to discuss common manifold pressure units. There seems to be some confusion on the part of some people about inches. What does that mean? Well, in the aviation world in North America, we're talking about inches of mercury absolute, and that would be 29.92 inches at sea level on a standard day. In the automotive world in North America, pounds per square inch is often used. However, there's two different measures of that, absolute and gauge, and that becomes quite confusing if you don't know which one a person is using, especially when we're changing altitude in aircraft. And in the metric world, kilopascals, 101 at sea level, and sometimes people use bar, which is basically 1 atmosphere. My videos will all use inches of mercury absolute, because that's what the common measure is in North America for aviation and pilots. Okay, so this is a twin-engine aircraft manifold pressure gauge, and it goes up to 75 inches. And when we start the engine, we would see the manifold pressure go down to somewhere around 10 or 12 inches. And as we advance the throttle, the manifold pressure will climb. And as we cross atmospheric pressure and start to make boost pressure, it'll climb to 30 inches, which is actually sea level pressure. And if we keep building more boost pressure, manifold pressure will keep increasing. So most spark ignition engines limit manifold pressure on takeoff to about 36 to maybe 42 inches. And we don't see anything much more than that on most turbocharged aircraft engines. The diesel, on the other hand, goes much higher than this gauge even registers. A lot of them will run 80 to even 95 inches, so it's much more than this gauge will even register. And we're coming back to the compressor map that I used in the Raptor video. I just wanted to explain a few other characteristics or things about compressor maps. And if you missed the first video, basically we have pressure ratio here from 1, and this is atmospheric pressure, up to 4. The maximum efficiency area is right around here, middle of this island, at about 2.1 pressure ratio. And on this side we have what's called the surge line. Centrifugal compressors can't operate to the left of the surge line here. Flow becomes very unstable, you get flow reversals, possible blade stall. You just can't operate it over here. So we need to keep it within this area here, hopefully. And on this side we have the choke line, and generally somewhere below 60% is considered choke, although not really true. However, the further we get this way, the hotter the compressed air is, because the compressor efficiency is lower. It's highest here, so efficiency is highest here. This is where the lowest temperature is from compressing the air. And over on this side it gets warmer again still. So ideally we like it to operate right here. However, that's not really possible in everyday conditions all the time. However, we never want to operate over here, and we never want to operate over here. And we can't operate up here either. This is the maximum RPM, or N1, of the compressor. And this is as fast as the compressor can safely turn. We'd want to be somewhat lower than that. So generally we kind of like to be in this area here if we can be. So we're going to start getting into the meat of this topic here. And we've got a chart here that's showing engine type. So we've got spark ignition, which is your standard gasoline engine, and diesel or compression ignition. We're just looking at the differences in manifold pressure that they typically run. So the spark ignition engine for takeoff power are typically between about 35 to 42 inches, whereas the diesel runs 75 to 90, and in some cases even up to 95 inches. In cruise, spark ignition engines around 30 to 35 normally, and the diesel is more than twice as high. 70 to 80 is pretty normal. And the critical altitude, we're using a 3.5 pressure ratio, which is pretty typical of modern compressors. So because the diesel runs a much higher manifold pressure, it has a much lower critical altitude. Critical altitude is really where the wastegate is fully closed, so it's using all the energy of the exhaust to spin the compressor, and the compressor is turning within its N1 limits, or RPM limits. So in both cases, the diesel and the spark ignition engine, they're limited to about 3.5 pressure ratio because of the limitations on the turbocharger for RPM. But because the spark ignition engine runs much lower manifold pressure, it would have a much higher critical altitude. So this is what the compressor is able to supply. So the compressor is able to supply this 30 to 35 inches up to 27,000 feet in the case of the spark ignition engine. However, because the diesel runs much higher manifold pressure, the turbo is pretty tapped out by 11,000 feet to develop this 70 inches of manifold pressure that it needs. So critical altitude is kind of determined by when the wastegate is fully closed. It's using all the exhaust energy to spin the compressor, but there's also a consideration of maximum N1, or maximum RPM, of the compressor. We can't keep spinning it faster and faster. It'll just explode or become very inefficient, like we saw in the last compressor map there. So that's a big disadvantage of the diesel for high altitude flight, because it needs much more manifold pressure to make the same horsepower as a spark ignition engine. They generally have lower critical altitudes than spark ignition engines. Generally we see them 12,000 to 20,000 for cruise power. For spark ignition engines, that's generally 24,000 to about 30,000, depending on the manifold pressure being run in cruise. If you run lower manifold pressure, you might eke out 30,000 feet with a single stage compressor. And as we discussed before, that's one of the main reasons that Raptor had 2 stages of compression. You just can't develop enough with one stage to make this kind of manifold pressure up there. So I generally skip the higher math and just come up with a graphical representation to illustrate points. So here we have a graph of compressor discharge temperature versus pressure ratio versus compressor efficiency. This is assuming the ambient air coming into the compressor at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It just makes calculation easier for me to come up with this graph. And on the left side, we've got compressor discharge temperature in Fahrenheit. And down here we have compressor pressure ratio. And over here we've got compressor efficiency. So we've got 5 lines with different compressor efficiency. This is the 50% line here, 60 here, 70, 80, and 100. And what we're trying to show here is that it's important to properly match compressors, and the main reason for that is that the lower the compressor efficiency, the higher the discharge temperature. So as you compress air, it gets hotter, and you might be surprised how hot it gets here. So in the case of Raptor, if you remember, maximum pressure ratio we needed there was about 7.2. That's about here. So if you had very low compressor efficiency towards the right of the compressor map, at 0 degrees inlet temperature at high altitude, the compressor discharge temperature would be almost 700 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty staggering. However, if we had 100% compressor efficiency, which is something we can't achieve, the temperature would only be about 330, 340 degrees, so about half. So typically we can get compressor efficiencies today of roughly 70 to 80%, which are these two lines. So even then, we get something like 475 degrees, assuming, say, 75% compressor efficiency. And that's why intercooling becomes really important. So we don't want the air entering the engine to be 450 degrees or 600 for that matter, or 700. So that's why we employ intercooling. So the intercooler performs the same basic function as it does in your car radiator. We've got very hot air from the compressor here on the inside, and outside we've got colder air flowing through the fins. And we're just trying to sink some of the heat off here and bring this high temperature down here somewhere if we can. So if we look at something typical here on Raptor, 7.2 pressure ratio and about 70% compressor efficiency, we'll assume those are fairly realistic numbers here. The compressor discharge temperature would be around 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And we'd like to drop that down at least in half, or as cold as we can get it. However, the more air we pass through the intercooler in an aircraft, the more drag there is. We're also limited in the aircraft cowling by volume. We can't fit really large intercoolers like we might be able to in some race cars. However, we do have a lot of air flowing by at very high speed, and it is colder at high altitude, so there's a few things working for us, a few things working against us. It's always a compromise between how cold we want to get the charge air versus how much drag we can suffer. However, if we look at the diesel here running this high pressure ratio, we see, say, about 500 degrees. Using the same compressor efficiency on a spark ignition engine where we only require something around 2.7, 2.8, we'll say 3 here. The air is only about less than half the temperature. That's another limitation of the diesel engine at high altitude. It requires this high pressure ratio here, and because of that it has high compressor discharge temperatures. And you need more intercooler to drop the temperatures down to reasonable levels than you do with a spark ignition engine, which runs much lower manifold pressure and therefore much lower pressure ratio, therefore much lower compressor discharge temperatures. So all things being equal, the same horsepower, spark ignition engine requires less intercooler and it should have less drag than the diesel engine would have. So this next graph looks at air density versus altitude. We've got air density over here, altitude in feet times 1,000 over here, so this is 20,000 feet. And this is unity here at sea level. We can see how the air density drops off with altitude. At 25,000 feet, we've only got about 45% of the sea level air density. So while the air gets colder and that makes it denser, the atmospheric pressure is falling off a lot. And why this is all important is because heat exchangers depend on mass flow or air density to cool. With a turbocharged engine, we maintain power to high altitude. However, the ability to cool it falls off considerably with altitude. So it becomes harder and harder, especially in the climb where you're going slow and don't have high speed or high mass flow through the heat exchangers. It becomes quite challenging if you're making a lot of power up high. It's not as bad as it seems, however. There's a few things working for us, and the main thing is that it gets colder up high, and also true airspeed increases as we climb. So this graph here is looking at cooling mass flow available at 140 knots indicated airspeed. So if we can indicate 140 knots at high altitude, we're going through the air a lot faster. So this is percent of mass flow available here. We got 100% at sea level. Again, the same altitude in feet times 1,000, so this is 25,000 here. So we looked at that other graph, it looked pretty bad. We'd only have 45% air density at 25,000. Because we're actually going at about 210 knots true here, that brings the available mass flow up to about 67, 68% at 25,000 feet. So it's not nearly as bad as it seemed on the density graph there. Okay, so here's a graphical representation of an intercooler setup. We've got hot air from the turbo compressor entering here into the top tank. That hot air goes down through the cores here, and as it passes through here, it's cooled. by the ambient air coming through the other way. And that exits out the other intercooler tank here and goes back to the intake manifold. And there's heat exchange here, of course, so our cool ambient air here picking up heat from the tubes here, and the warmed air exits the intercooler core here. So what does an aircraft intercooler installation look like? Here's a shot from my Subaru powered RV6A, and my turbocharger is buried behind the engine here. This is the discharge pipe from the compressor, comes up here, goes into the intercooler tank, and then up these tubes here, gets cooled down as it comes out here, and this goes into the throttle body up here. And here's an intercooler set up on a 2-stroke WAM diesel, which is 30 to 40 less horsepower than my Subaru. You notice it's quite a lot larger than my intercooler, and that's again necessary because of the high manifold pressures the diesel has to run to make same sort of power as a spark ignition engine. And you'll notice the same sort of trend on the 2-liter Continental and T-Lert and Austro engines. They have really large intercoolers compared to most spark ignition engines. So we're going to have a more close-up look about intercooler design. This is a typical air-to-air intercooler. Hot air from the compressor is coming in this pipe here into this tank. And the air flows across these tubes here over to the other tank. And this goes to the throttle body. These fins here, just like the fins in your radiator, they're designed to have a lot of surface area here and conduct heat away from the tube, which then conducts it away from the air inside here. And this is one of the 2 cores in my RV10 setup here, which had the 6-cylinder 3.3 liter Subaru, about 275 horsepower. And these intercoolers are roughly 5.5 by 6 inches by 3.5 inches deep each. And here's how all that was arranged on my RV10 engine. This engine has twin turbos underneath. The air would come up from underneath here, go through each intercooler and down here, and go into a Y pipe into the throttle body, single throttle body here. So it had twin turbos, twin intercoolers, single throttle body. So let's take a better look inside the intercooler. So this is a shot inside the RV10 intercooler. So you can see the tubes here, and the ambient air is flowing through the fins here. And the charge air is flowing through these passages here, so it's flowing upwards into the tank. You can see they've got fins on here, and we've also got fins inside here. And that's to increase the surface area, and that's very important for heat transfer. All good air-to-air heat exchangers have finning on both sides. Some of the cheaper ones don't have the finning on the inside here, and they're less effective, so they have less temperature drop, less efficient overall. And here we've got a close-up view of the RV10 intercooler core. This is from the outside, the ambient air side. So the charge air is going through the tubes along here. And then the air from atmosphere is going through. You can see not only do we have fins here, but the fins are pierced or louvered, and they're set in and outwards. That's to get more air to wet them and more surface area. That increases heat transfer from the tubes here, the charge air, into the atmosphere here, makes them more effective. And here's an ultra close view, slightly different angle, so you can see the louvered fin structure here. Just gives you a little bit better view of how a really good intercooler is constructed. So here's how we calculate intercooler effectiveness. We take the compressor discharge temperature and subtract the intercooler outlet temperature, so on the other side, coming out of the intercooler, over the compressor discharge temperature minus the cooling medium temperature. So in the case of most aircraft, that's outside air temperature. So we'll choose 450 degrees compressor discharge temperature, and we're dropping it to 200 degrees. And again, we take the compressor discharge temperature and our cooling medium. As in the compressor maps, we're going to assume that's 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So that equals 250 over 450, which equals 0.555, or about 56%. So that's the intercooler effectiveness. And we'd like to see this as high as possible. It's never possible to get it up to 100%. This is kind of mediocre, but we're starting with a very high temperature here on account of the diesel engine in this case. And It's not as cold as it might be at 25,000, but in any case, this is not too bad, but we'd like to see this probably up more at 75, 80% if we could. However, that means a larger intercooler, which means more drag, so it's kind of a vicious circle. We're just going to look at an airplane which was designed around the engine, turbocharger, and intercooler system from scratch, probably one of the few. This is a P-47 from World War II. Used an R-2800 radial engine, and they ducted the exhaust down here, back to the turbocharger, way back in the aft part of the fuselage. This is the turbine here, and the turbine discharge. The exhaust comes out here. This is the compressor section, and the air was compressed, went through the intercooler cores, and up through twin pipes back to the engine and supercharger where it was compressed further. So this was a two-stage system. The P-47 was designed to operate 25 to 35,000 feet, and it was very fast up there because of the two-stage system. So you can see this is a 2,000 horsepower class engine, very big. You can see the size of these components here compared to what we're talking about on general aviation aircraft. But you can see the immense size of the intercooler they used. Now this R-28 engine was running about 52 inches of manifold pressure. So the pressure ratio at say 35,000 feet is approximately 5.5 to 6. And the air was getting very hot from the turbocharger, obviously, and they had to cool it way down. So I had this very large duct here. The air for feeding the intercooler core was through this long duct here. So it comes through the core and exits through two doors, one on each side of the fuselage. You can see how large these are. With these high pressure ratios, the intercooler heat loads are about equal to the engine cooling heat loads. And Raptor, with the very high pressure ratios it needs, will need an immense intercooler, much larger than it has presently to work properly at 25,000. So here's a nice shot from the right side. You can see the twin exhaust pipes here, one here, the other one here, carrying exhaust from the collector ring back to the turbine inlet. And in the center is a big aluminum duct, and some of this air is split off to go to the compressor inlet here, and the rest of it goes to feed the intercooler cores. So the air is split kind of between two cores here. This is the discharge pipe here, and there is an adjustable exit door on each side here to control intercooler outlet flow. And the exhaust exits through this housing here, and they had a stainless steel hood which was on the bottom belly part of the aircraft, and that's where the exhaust ultimately exited. And compressed air here goes through the core all the way back through these twin pipes here back to the supercharger inlet where it was compressed again. And that was the two stages of compression. Here's a good look from the left side, more detail of the intercooler outlet door. And you can see a little bit better view of the exhaust discharge turbine here, compressor, and all the ductwork. Here's a close-up view of the right side. And you can see how they constructed all the transitions here. They're pretty smooth. They don't have any abrupt changes in diameter. And when they have to make a very tight bend, you can see the rivet lines here, and they've got guide vanes inside this to reduce the turbulence, making this sharp bend into the compressor inlet. So these guys definitely knew what they were doing here. Here's a shot of my Subaru EG33 twin turbo, and you can see the intake manifold I fabricated here. This is custom, and the intercooler is one on each side here. We've got very large piping, smooth ducts, smooth mandrel bends here, and a Y transition going into the 75 millimeter throttle body here. So it's a lot different than the P-47, but packaging is a big deal here, and I obviously couldn't mount the turbochargers in the tail and have all that plumbing run through the cabin. Didn't have the space for that. So this is a pretty efficient setup in my view. It just looks a lot different than the P-47. Here's my turbocharged RV6A in formation with Shane Getson's turbocharged RV7. So here's a photo of the Subaru EJ22 turbo that's in my RV6A. You can see a lot of custom fabricated pieces here to pick up on the engine mounts. I custom fabricated this intake manifold, fuel rails, a lot of special welding, I had a vacuum pump mounted on it here. That's now gone. And the turbocharger mounts down here on some rigid mounts. And we use slip joints, the exhaust system, to take up thermal expansion here so we don't get pipe cracking. Some of the new viewers were wondering what other aircraft I'd done turbo work on. Here's my EG33 twin turbo. Here's the turbo setup on my RV6 with the EJ22. And I helped match the turbo for this RV7 with a EJ257 in it. My friend Ralph Inkster actually built this airplane. This is it in flight here. Very fast RV7. Subaru turbo worked really well here. And again, for some of the new viewers here, my company also supplies the electronic fuel injection and ignition systems for Andy Findley's Lancer Super Legacy, which is the fastest piston-powered Lancer in the world. 409 mile-an-hour laps at Reno. I did not match the turbos on this. I only assist with the EFI and the ignition, but pretty good friends with Andy, and he's got a fantastic team here. They've got 2 wins at Reno using our EFI, and it's a super fast airplane. It sounds really good. Just have a couple sound clips for you here at the end. Hope you enjoy this. Andy really shows us what you can do with turbocharged spark ignition engines here.